This is a production of Cornell University.
Welcome to Mann Library's Chats in the Stacks Book Talk series. In today's talk, originally presented at Mann Library on October 19, 2006, horticulture professor Ken Mudge reflects on the promise of forest farming, the cultivation and harvest of medicinal herbs, fruits, mushrooms, and nuts under a thriving tree canopy as a sustainable agroforestry system for the region.
Thank you very much, Ken. Thank you for that introduction. I certainly appreciate all the work that Evelyn Ferretti and Ashley Miller and everyone else has done. It's just great to see this crowd here and all the people who have participated. It's a pleasure to participate here myself. As you can see, the title of this talk is Forest Farming as an Agroforestry System for the Northeast. Now, I suspect that some of you aren't familiar with the concept of agroforestry, but maybe everyone who came is. It's a good place to start anyway. Agroforestry is defined by the National Agroforestry Center in Lincoln, Nebraska as the intentional mixing of trees or shrubs into crop and or animal production systems, sustainable systems, to create environmental, economic, and social benefits. So we're not simply talking about growing forests for their recreational value, their wildlife value, or for timber. We're talking about growing trees and shrubs along with other crops for multiple purposes. Now, agroforestry has developed very strongly in tropical parts of the world, but over the last several decades it's really matured here in the temperate zone, and they're generally described 5 different temperate agroforestry systems, including, of course, forest farming, which we'll have much more to say about. There are windbreak systems, alley cropping systems, which involves growing rows of trees with crops between the rows. Silvopasture systems involving animals and trees. And finally, riparian buffer strips, streams and rivers, and that sort of thing. So let's now talk about forest farming per se. It was defined as really for the first time in an organized way by Deborah Hill and Louise Buck. You've already heard Louise introduced here, as the intentional manipulation of forest lands to produce a regular supply of food, medicinal, ornamental, and other non-timber forest products. That's what we're focusing on today, are the non-timber forest products. Certainly timber is a very important part of forest production, but we're focused on those non-timber products. A couple of characteristics of forest farming systems. One, that it's a multi-purpose system. As I say, we're not just focused on the trees alone, but other crops that can be grown in association with those trees. And it's a multi-layered system. We're talking about the forest canopy above, a mid-story of trees, small trees and shrubs, and an understory where we can grow crops like medicinal herbs such as ginseng, mushrooms, and things like that. So it's a layered system. Here are several benefits of forest farming systems. Stimulate landowner interest in forest management. There are so many people who own private woodlands in this state and other parts of the Northeast, and I think it's important to keep those forest lands vital. Diversify products and improve profits. There is some potential to make income from these sorts of things. Reduce collection pressure on scarce plants. That can be very important, and that may be a factor in some of the medicinals that we'll talk about. And improve forest conservation and health. It can be very useful in that regard. And I like to think of it as a sort of productive conservation that combines production with protection. Now, why do I describe forest farming as particularly suitable for the Northeast, in particular New York? You can look at this and see that over 60% of New York State is forested land, and about 85% of that is privately owned. There is a lot of privately owned woodlots and forests, And many people that own these things are interested in a variety of uses of that land. And certainly forest farming is compatible with that. I'd like to talk about forest farming in general today, but I'd like to highlight what we're doing right here on the Cornell campus. We're talking about a piece of property, Cornell property, that we've dubbed over the last several years the McDaniels Nut Grove. McDaniels Nut Grove is located just to the south of the Cornell orchards. You can see Route 366 right here, so we're off there somewhere. And the Nut Grove is a 7-acre piece of land right here, just to the south of the orchard, and along the steep slope leading down to Cascadilla Creek. It used to be just an overgrown forest, and we've tried to develop it as a forest farming site. The land that we're talking about is managed by Cornell Plantations. It's part of the Upper Cascadilla Natural Area right over there. And I want to mention Cornell Plantations because they have been extremely supportive of what we're doing there, both financially and in every other way. Now, the name McDaniels Nut Grove comes from the man who first started using that land for trees. Lawrence McDaniels was at Cornell for a very long time, very well-known professor. Served in the Department of Pomology from 1919 to 1940. Then he switched to the Department of Floriculture. He was chairman in floriculture for a while, shortly before he retired in 1956. Dr. Mack, as he's called, was well known for his expertise in pomology, fruit trees, but he was also considered a real national expert in temperate nut trees. As you can see, he was president of the NNGA, that's the Northern Nut Growers Association. Yes, there is a Northern Nut Growers Association. Interesting group of people. Now, Dr. Mack retired in 1956, but he remained professionally active for another 30 years. He was quite a productive guy. Spent a lot of time in the tropics, worked with bananas, worked with temperate crops, and so forth. Now, the land that we're talking about was completely denuded of trees back in the 1920s, bulldozed and terraced, as you can see here. And then, as the site grew back up to trees, McDaniels began to develop it as a nut tree variety trial, allowing native nut trees, wild nut trees to grow up on the site, as well as planting seedlings and so forth. That's an early grafted tree right there. Now, the site was actually introduced to me several years ago by a fellow named Brian Caldwell, who's been here at Cornell for many years. He was a friend of Dr. Mack's, and he was aware of these nut trees on the site, but very few people were. I don't know, maybe a half a dozen people that I've ever known were even aware of the trees being there. Brian showed me a few of these, and you could hardly find them because the site was so densely choked with this invasive honeysuckle. After Brian showed me a few of the trees, in the early spring, before that honeysuckle leafed out, I was walking along the ridge there, going towards the east, and you could see all these kind of unusual trees. Oftentimes you see this sort of thing, it's hard to tell what's going on. But it really became quickly apparent that there were many, many grafted nut trees, and that's what you see right there. First thing we did was to begin clearing the site of all that honeysuckle, and that was a big job for the first summer. You can see the site, which was once covered with that honeysuckle. This is in the winter. Much of it's been removed, and that's what these piles are down below, stacks of honeysuckle branches. Now, it's this tall fellow right here, Keith Vanderhei, that did most of that clearing. I mean, he's a strong guy, and he would just kind of yank these things out by the roots. There is Louise Buck, my colleague, who's been active in the Cornell agroforestry community for a very long time. I have more to say about her contributions in a minute. One of the reasons we've begun to develop the McDaniels Nut Grove is to develop it as an outdoor classroom, an experiential learning center, if you will. And as Janet McHugh mentioned, we teach a course there. It's called Practicum in Forest Farming, and it's just what it says. It's almost entirely hands-on learning, very little time spent in the classroom. This is a group of students from last year's class, and right here is my graduate student, Emily Gallagher. She's been extremely important in teaching the course for the last 2 years, and she's managed the site for us and done a real good job in helping us develop it along. This is just a sort of synopsis of the syllabus of the course. As I say, students do the work, and they've really taken, sort of developed an ownership for the experience. They're involved in nut tree cultivation, harvest, evaluation of the nut varieties, mushroom culture, fruits and small fruit trees, and culture of medicinal herbs, as well as some other activities in addition to those. So let me talk now about the various categories of non-timber forest products. First one I just want to mention quickly is maple syrup and maple products. I'm not going to talk more about that, but by far and away, the most economically important of the non-timber forest products in New York State is maple syrup. There are a couple of booths in the back. Schuyler County and Arnott Forest have displays about maple products, so we'll take a look at that later on. And then there are the medicinals, such as the ginseng shown there, the Shitake mushrooms. We'll talk about other species as well, including that log right there. Nut trees, like the hickories and walnuts, and fruits, like the raspberries. So I'll talk about these in the context of what we're doing at McDaniels Nut Grove. Let's start out with these medicinals, shade-loving medicinals that grow on the forest floor. The most valuable by far is ginseng, but there are other shade-loving forest medicinals such as bloodroot, golden seal, blue cohosh, and others. Ginseng, as I say, is certainly the most valuable and sought out forest herbs. This is a typical storage root, the root of ginseng, which is the source of these pharmaceutically active chemicals called ginsenicides, and presumably they are associated with the vast mixture of reasons that people take ginseng. Structurally, we're looking at a storage root, sort of like a sweet potato or something. On top of it is a rhizome, a neck-like structure that you can see there with an apical bud on it. Here's a close-up of that rhizome. Storage root is right over here, and this is the neck or the rhizome. And you can see these raised portions along the rhizome. One of these bud scars forms every year, so you can determine the age of the plant by counting these. 1, 2, 3, 4, I think there are 12, indicating that's a 12-year-old root, and that's a large 12-year-old root. This is the apical bud. It occurs underground. It forms in late summer, and it's a very interesting plant because next year's plant is entirely preformed within that apical bud. So that come spring, that thing will push out a shoot above ground, and it'll just grow a single flush about 1 foot tall, and then it's entirely determinate. It doesn't branch, doesn't put on any more growth throughout the entire summer. That means it's a very slow-growing crop, and it takes a long time to produce it as a commodity. Now they tell me, I don't speak Chinese, but they tell me that ginseng translates in Chinese into man root or something approximately like that. And traditionally, the more person or man-like the root is, the more valuable it is. And so maybe you can use your imagination and see what I'm talking about there. Enough said. Now, there are several different ways to make money off of ginseng. The most potentially profitable one is the harvest of wild ginseng. Now, people often think that ginseng is a rare endangered plant. It's not on the endangered plant list. It's not even on the threatened list. It is uncommon in New York State. You kind of have to know what you're looking for, and in particular, know the site characteristics where ginseng can be found. Wild harvest is permitted in the state of New York and many other eastern states. The month of September is legal season for harvesting ginseng in New York State. This is another, I would say, Mann-like root here. The plant typically has 3 to 5 palmately compound leaves. In this case, 4 of them. It's called a four-pronger. And you can see the inflorescence, the seeds beginning to develop right there in the middle. I forgot to mention the tremendous value of wild ginseng. It sells for as much as $600 a pound. And so there is some motivation for hunting wild ginseng. Now, there are a couple of systems where ginseng can be deliberately cultivated. One of these, and certainly the most common, is intensively produced ginseng. This is grown in places like Wisconsin, British Columbia, Ontario, very big producers of intensively cultivated ginseng, where it's grown under artificial shade cloth, very expensive proposition, grown at very, very high densities, and consequently it's necessary to use high rates of fungicides, pesticides, fertilizers, and so forth. I've heard it said that this is one of the most intensively farmed crops in North America. But the irony is that it's grown so intensively, and yet the value of the crop compared to wild ginseng is really low, to the point where it's, in some cases, hardly worth growing as a crop. Now, forest-grown ginseng is a different matter, and that's really what we're here to talk about today. Ginseng can be grown as a forest crop, much less intensively than the intensively cultivated ginseng. This is a forest garden where you see it's a lower plant density. It's using the natural shade of the forest canopy, and it can be done very, very non-intensively, so-called wild simulated ginseng, where you just scatter the seeds on the ground, and that's about all you do for the next 10 years or so. And then there is more intensively cultivated forest-grown ginseng, where you hill up a raised bed, and depending on the grower, you may apply some fungicides and things like that. But at any rate, good forest-grown ginseng can sell for a respectable price, something like $200 a pound, which is very similar to the wild ginseng in character, and so its value is somewhat higher than the roots that are produced intensively. Now, I want to introduce someone here that's very important in East Coast ginseng production. This is Bob Beifuss, from extension educator from Greene County. He's here today, and Bob is a noted authority on ginseng cultivation. In fact, I would say I don't know of anyone that is so dedicated to a particular crop as Bob. Now, maybe if you're really nice to him, he might show you his arm this afternoon. It's quite a tattoo. Bob has developed a number of very useful extension publications on ginseng cultivation. He has a display right back there from the Greene County Agroforestry Resource Center, and I believe he has some of his publications back there. One of the most useful ones, I think, is the visual site assessment. And this is a tool that Bob has developed for helping forest owners determine whether their land is suitable for ginseng or not. It's based on the ecology of wild ginseng primarily. He spent a lot of time in the woods looking at the conditions under which ginseng grows and has modeled this tool after that. Points are awarded for each of 6 different categories. One of these is the dominant tree species. It turns out that sugar maple is particularly well suited for growing ginseng. Exposure, it helps. In fact, it's almost essential to have a north or a northeast facing slope where it's cool and moist. Slope characteristics is usually on fairly steep land, from 10 to 25% slope. A number of soil characteristics are typical of ginseng areas where it occurs naturally, such as high organic matter, high calcium level. The herbaceous understory, the indicator plants, are a very good sign that your land may be suitable for ginseng. Indicator plants like maidenhair fern, rattlesnake fern, blue cohosh, trillium, and a number of others. You get lots of points for those particular indicator plants. And security. That's pretty important because poaching of ginseng can be a very serious problem. And Bob says if you have a guard dog near your crop, you get a lot of points for that. Now, we do grow some ginseng at the McDaniels Nut Grove, but all we do are these little boxes here on the hillside. The fact is that the McDaniels Nut Grove down here is a south-facing slope. It's a poor soil. It's not particularly well suited for ginseng. And yet we want students to see what this cultivation of this medicinal is all about. So we've constructed these artificial beds, added a lot of organic matter to the soil, and done what we could to improve the conditions. And yes, we can grow ginseng fairly well there. Students will go out to the Arnott Forest and harvest it from a seed bed that was planted some years ago, bring it back to McDaniels and plant it out there. Now you may see the wire mesh that's over the structures there, chicken wire. In fact, you can see it close up right here. That's because of white-tailed deer. They are the single most serious problem as far as ginseng is concerned. It has been said by Jim McGraw, a plant ecologist in West Virginia, that white-tailed deer are a more serious problem than people harvesting the plant. And within the century, it will be gone because of the deer pressure. This plant in the lower left here, it's not because plants are all chlorotic at the McDaniels Nut Grove. That's the color it turns in the fall, just before it goes down for the winter. So the plant is perennial, but it overwinters underground. You can see the bright red berries, which are a good indicator for wild ginseng. If you're looking for it in the woods and you see these clusters of red berries, bingo. All right, now let's consider another category of forest crops. Up in the top left there, the mushrooms. Forest gourmet and medicinal mushrooms. This is a really interesting area. It has considerable economic value, not like $600 a pound like ginseng, but it's possible to make some money off of this crop. Now here you have Shitake mushrooms. If you've seen them uncooked, you may have seen them at a grocery store like this. They sell for $5 or $6 a pound, and if you ask me, they don't look very attractive, kind of all dried out and small. Fact is that in most situations like this, shiitake has been grown in climate-controlled rooms on artificial blocks of sawdust. And I guess if you harvest them real fresh, they're pretty good quality, but often in the grocery stores they've been sitting around for a couple of weeks. And I don't think they're nearly as nice as the ones we grow in the forest. This log's kind of heavy, so I hope I don't drop it. But this is a log that was inoculated with a shiitake mushroom fungus about a year ago. It takes a year or so for the fungal mycelium to really colonize the log. And then after that year, it begins to fruit. So we took this out of the nut grove about a week and a half ago, and I actually put it in my basement so it would be a little warmer and make sure it would have this good crop of mushrooms by the time we got here today. I'll put this in the back later on so you can take a good look at it. Yes. There's a special way to get that to happen very uniformly that I'll mention in just a moment. In addition to shiitake mushrooms, we also grow oyster mushrooms, another potentially valuable forest crop. This is not as expensive as shiitake. In fact, those beautiful shiitake mushrooms there would sell at the Ithaca Farmers Market fresh for $15 to $16 a pound, in contrast to the $5 or $6 for the grocery store shiitake. These oyster mushrooms would sell under any conditions for about $5 or $6 a pound. And then this is one of the other mushrooms that we're attempting to grow at McDaniels. Lion's mane is a very interesting fungus. It doesn't look like a mushroom at all, sort of like these little tiny icicles. And it's not frequently grown as a forest crop. It's more often collected from the wild. But there are some progress being made in growing it on logs, and it's one of the species that we're working with at McDaniels. Now, I've seen this for sale in grocery stores, grown under those artificial conditions for about $30 a pound. So that's why we're trying to develop it as a crop. We have gotten some research and extension funding to study and work with these forest mushrooms. And this is a project that quite a few people are involved with, where we're looking at, as I say, these 3 different species of mushrooms. And we're testing each one on each of 4 different tree substrates. Now, it's often said that the best kind of tree to grow mushrooms on is red oak, or any oak tree. Very high density wood with plenty of lignin and hemicellulose that these saprophytic fungi feed on. But these other species like red maple, beech, and aspen, they're often very common on someone's woodlot, and they're considered sort of trash species. If you're going to improve your forest, you're often going to thin out some of these species, and there isn't much to do with them. They're not real valuable as firewood, and even if they were, firewood isn't worth all that much. So we're trying to determine how effectively they can be used for cultivation of these mushrooms. I don't expect they'll be necessarily quite as effective as the oaks, but we'll see what we can get out of them. And we're also interested in moisture management. One of the most serious limiting factors to cultivation of mushrooms, probably the most serious cause of failure, is simply the log dries out. You harvest these logs live at about 45 or higher % moisture content, and if it drops below about 25% moisture, the log is dead, the fungus is dead. So you have to provide conditions where it doesn't dry out. We use waxing as one technique to minimize moisture loss. Now, as I said, our project is both research and extension. And so we came up with a way to get other people to help us set up this large experiment last spring. This is sort of like how Tom Sawyer gets the fence painted. We organized a workshop. Jim Arctersky was instrumental in setting things up, doing all the groundwork to put on this workshop at the Arnott Forest in March, late March. And we had about 25 volunteers. Actually, they even paid room and board for the 2 days at the Arnott. We spent a day teaching them about mushroom cultivation, and then after feeding them a pancake breakfast with Arnott maple syrup, we put them to work the next day and actually set up that experiment that I just described to you. It showed up in the newspaper. It's Heather Irving's picture right there. I don't know if she's in the audience now or not. But here we are in the goat shed of the Arnott Forest. And it's a really cold March day. I bet it was about 20 degrees. It was hard to handle these things with gloves on, so people had cold fingers. Now, I want to see if this is going to work. Sometimes the technology lets us down. This is Peter Hobbs, my colleague. He helps me teach the course, Practicum in Forest Farming. And with any luck, here we go. This video was put together by Paul Treadwell, instructional technology specialist in Cooperative Extension. He's helped us with the education part of these projects a great deal. There's a group of people working there. I think I recognize those guys. That's Sonam Sherpa and Nick Leskowski, both members of the Cornell Mushroom Club. You start out with a live tree. You have to have a live tree, not a piece of firewood. Cut it down in early spring, ideally. And there's Nick boring out holes in the log, 5/16" holes about 1 inch deep. A lot of work. And then these are wooden dowels that have been impregnated with the mycelium of the shiitake or other fungus. Just pound them into the holes. And then each hole is waxed over with hot cheese wax, food grade wax, to waterproof it, as well as to keep other fungi from getting in and competing. And this is out at the laying yard, where you're putting the mushrooms to incubate for a year out in the woods, various configurations such as this log cabin sort of configuration, which is kind of high. This is an A-frame, lower to the ground, but a larger footprint. This can be covered with snow, and it's a good way to overwinter. And finally, a lean-to sort of structure there. We're trying out these different structures. That was Paul's choice of music. And there's Kathy Hodge, our resident mycologist. She's involved in the project as well. And she was out there working in late March, getting her fingers cold. Here's the laying yard that we have out near the sugar house at the Arnott Forest. That's where this experiment is. And this is only a small fraction of the logs that we inoculated that day. That's Joe Lardner, my technician. And all these logs have been incubating out there for about 6 months now. And we hope to get our first crop of mushrooms in early next summer. This is that other style of stacking the logs. It sits pretty high, but it doesn't take up much space, and it's a good way to incubate the logs. Now, one thing about shiitake mushrooms, as contrasted to the others, is that you can pretty well program the crop. So if you're going off to the farmer's market, you can be pretty sure you're going to have a crop of mushrooms to take on a particular day. And the way you do that is by shocking the logs, as they say. I'm not sure what really goes on physiologically, but what you do is you soak the logs in cold water for about 24 hours. In fact, that's what I did with that log over there Sunday a week ago. And within a couple of days, it begins to form these little pins, little primordial mushrooms. And within 3 days in warm weather, maybe 7 or so days in cooler weather, the log is bursting with mushrooms like that. And you can pretty well count on that sequence and harvest it regularly. With some of the other fungi, you just kind of wait for it to happen. But shiitake can be programmed. When you're doing this shocking routine, you can do it about twice a season. And you can do it again and again and again for about 5 years. So consider that piece of wood as firewood, I don't know, 50 cents or something. But if you harvest mushrooms regularly off that log for 5 years and you get $15 a pound, you can see that you can use that log a lot more effectively than just firewood. I wanted to call your attention to the Cornell Mushroom Club. They have a demonstration table out there in the back, and it's been an amazingly enthusiastic group of students. There are about 30 of them. They get together every other week on Thursdays, and I've done a lot of things. I've done a lot of mushroom inoculation down in McDaniels Nut Grove, and other things that the students really enjoy doing. All right, now I'd like then to consider a third category of forest crops. In the lower left, that's a hickory nut. And so we're talking about temperate nuts of several different species. At the McDaniels Nut Grove, we have a rich collection of shagbark hickory, primarily, some shellbark hickory, and hybrids between shagbark and shellbark. Black walnut. You'll find both the hickories and the walnuts in the back of the room. Big nut cracker, and you can use it to crack out some of those tasty nuts. Japanese walnuts are down there. Chinese chestnut was planted at the Nut Grove in the cold snap of 1935, I think it was, where it got about 33 degrees below freezing. Killed off most of those Chinese chestnut, but there's still several of them left. And filberts are another potential forest farming crop. We don't have those at McDaniels Nut Grove, but they are a good crop to consider. We obtained, early on in the development of the Nut Grove, we obtained some funding from the Northern Nut Groves Association, and the goal was to evaluate some of these old varieties that McDaniels planted, because most of them had sort of been lost from the record. He labeled a lot of the varieties with these zinc labels, but most of the labels had been fallen off or kind of consumed by the bark, and as it turns out, 80% or more of the trees, we have no idea what they are, even though they're grafted and they're clearly selected varieties. They're kind of anonymous to us. So we went back to evaluate them and see which ones of them had good characteristics as edible nuts. So what we do is weigh them and measure them, And then we do the big crack out. That same nut cracker is in the back of the room. It looks like overkill, but some of these nuts can be really difficult to break open, particularly the walnuts. So we crack them out, and that's really an important part of evaluating nut quality. These are some photographic records that we've taken on the different varieties we've been evaluating. And one of the most important things, as I say, is how the nut cracks out of the shell. Perfect situation is sort of like a pecan, where it breaks into two intact halves, such as you see here. But unfortunately, what happens more frequently with hickories is that they crack out into multiple pieces. They're not quite as neat and tidy as a pecan is. And that's because pecans have been selected much more intensively over a longer period of time than the other hickories are. By the way, pecans are another hickory species. So at any rate, we've spent some time evaluating these nut varieties. I'll just show you this to make the point that wild hickory nuts would be, about 3/4 of an inch diameter, like the one on the right there. Some of the selections that have been made, one of the selection criteria is to get bigger and bigger nuts, have more nut meat, and hopefully they'll crack out well. Should have pointed out that these little invaginations in the wall have a lot to do with whether the nut cracks out cleanly or not. The deeper they go in, the harder it is for the nut to crack out intact. Now, in addition to having evaluation of some of the older trees, we like to bring new varieties into the collection, and we use basically the same approach that McDaniels used originally, and that's cloning by grafting. Basically, the idea is McDaniels then, or some of the nut enthusiasts now, will find an exceptional nut tree, maybe back behind the barn or something, and McDaniels would learn about these through some of the contests back in the 30s, and he would take a sample of the tree called a scion, in other words, a stick about the size of a pencil, and this is a rather large rootstock. The scion is the upper portion of the grafted plant. The rootstock is the lower portion. Carve a piece of wood out of there and place wood against wood very tightly, cambium against cambium. And they're actually nailed into place with small tacks right there. This is a inlay bark graft. You can see it developing in the lower right there. And then after, in this case, 50 or more years, that little graft union develops into something very substantial. This is a compatible combination. This is shagbark hickory grafted on to a seedling of shagbark hickory. And so when you graft like on like, it is much more likely to take successfully than when you graft two different species of hickory together, like the shagbark hickory grafted onto the pignut hickory on the right side of the picture. In this case, the tree developed pretty well for several decades, but then it begins to form these bulges and cracks, which is a sign of a delayed incompatibility. Sometimes these survive. In fact, that tree is still alive, and other times the incompatibility kills the tree. Here's a cross-section showing a compatible combination of shagbark on shagbark, and you can see the wood is essentially continuous. You can't tell where the graft union is at all. What you see right here is a remnant of the original scion. You can actually see those tacks that are still in the wood. In fact, when I ran this over my friend's planer, he almost had a heart attack, so did I. On the right side is a longitudinal section through a shagbark pignut combination, and that formed the big bulge that you saw in the previous picture. You can see very clearly the discontinuity between the wood of the stalk and the scion, discoloration and so forth. And here, in about the last 10 years of growth, the wood was not continuous at all. It was a big split, and the bark was split too. And eventually, that resulted in this tree dying, fall down, and we cut it off and sectioned it. So this is one of the things that McDaniels was interested in, trying out different combinations of grafting scions and stock together, and he concluded that the only safe combination was like on like. As I say, we've been bringing some of these nut trees into the collection. This is a Wilcox variety that we grafted onto one of the large seedling rootstocks on the site. It started out that year with a piece about the size of a pencil. And within a single year, it put on 24 inches of growth or so. Very, very big rootstock, driving the very small scion, putting on a considerable amount of growth. Now that both sides of that tree are about 1.5 meters long, after about 3 years. Now, how do you harvest nuts that are up in a 70-foot tall tree? No, we don't have trained squirrels. I wish we did. As it turns out, squirrels are our nemesis. They often get them before we do. And so we've come up with a strategy for beating the squirrels to it. Let me show you how we do it. This is a giant slingshot. This is what an arborist uses to get a rope up in a tall tree. Expand that a bit. And there's Rich, former manager, shooting this line up into the tree. You can see it coming down the other side of the branch. And he just shakes the thing. And if I had the audio on, it isn't very clear, but you can actually hear the nuts hitting the ground. Oh yeah, I guess there's the audio. Yeah. Listen. Well, I thought I could hear him before.
Somebody else want to shake it?
This is the class, by the way. And there goes Jesse.
Sure.
Giving it a good pull. Goes flying up into the tree.
There you go.
As much as 60 feet or so. And loops around the branch, come back down, and we shake them off. Finally, I guess I would like to conclude by talking about this fourth category of non-timber forest crop, that is the fruits of various kinds. We've tried growing quite a number of different species at McDaniels Nut Grove. Black raspberries, a couple different kinds of raspberries, currants and gooseberries. Honeyberry is an edible honeysuckle, chokeberry, beach plum, serviceberry, and some others. Most of these are small fruits, small shrubs. The pawpaw and the persimmon are trees, and pawpaw is a small-sized tree that can be grown in the mid-story underneath the canopy of tall trees. There are a couple of different stations here that have pawpaws for you to taste today. It's an interesting North American fruit that most people haven't tasted. That's a small pawpaw seedling that we planted several years ago. It's much bigger now. They're performing well under the shade. They're not yet old enough to form fruit. That fruit didn't come from McDaniels. It's a picture off the internet. But it's this large Native American fruit, one of the largest Native American fruits that there is. I mentioned earlier that we have an educational effort, an educational component to our project, and Louise Buck, I want to give her credit for being the one to really mobilize the educational component of our project. She's brought together a team of people several years ago, including plant ecologist Todd Dawson, herself as a natural resource specialist, a ginseng expert, Bob Beifuss, and myself as a horticulturist, and a number of different extension educators, including Bob, Jim Artersky, and some others, to work on the development of some online resources for teaching forest farming to forest landowners. So we've developed this product called the How, When, and Why of Forest Farming. Janet mentioned that my grafting course is the How, When, and Why of grafting, so we kind of stole off of that. This is the group got together at the Agroforestry Resource Center in Greene County to begin to develop this project. It includes quite a few folks, not only the people that I've pretty much already mentioned, but collaborators from Penn State University, Mike Jacobson and Eric Burkhart, and additional extension educators from both New York and Pennsylvania. It's been a very interesting group to work with, and it's been a real pleasure. So with that, I think I'll open it up to questions. Thank you.
This has been a production of Cornell University. On the web at cornell.edu.